I left my home to them in my will. Then one night I heard my daughter-in-law on the phone saying, "When he dies, we'll gut the place and sell every bit." My son replied, "He won't last much longer." They didn't know I was behind the door listening. The next morning I walked into my lawyer's office and asked him to. I didn't make a sound when I heard it. That's the part that still unsettles me the most. Not the words themselves, not even the way my own son said them like he was commenting on the weather. It was how still I went, like my body understood before my mind could catch up. I was halfway down the hallway outside the guest room. They thought I'd gone to bed hours earlier. Truth is, I don't sleep much anymore. Not since the diagnosis. Not since everything started slowing down inside me while the rest of the world kept moving like nothing had changed. The door was cracked open, just enough for their voices to slip through. My daughter-in-law was the first one I heard. "When he dies, we'll gut the place and sell every bit." She didn't whisper it, she said it casually, like she was talking about redecorating, like the house wasn't something I built with my own hands 40 years ago, like it wasn't where I buried my wife. There was a pause, then my son answered. "He won't last much longer." I remember gripping the wall beside me because suddenly I couldn't feel my legs properly. Not from illness, from something else, something colder. "They kept talking." She laughed a little. "I've already been looking at listings. Property values around here have gone up. We could make a clean break, start somewhere nicer." He didn't argue, didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said, "it's time." Time. That word stayed with me. Time for what? For me to die, for them to move on, for my entire life to be stripped, sold, and erased like it never meant anything. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10, long enough to hear them plan pieces of my future like I wasn't still breathing. They talked about renovations, about knocking down walls, about selling off old junk. That's what she called it. Old junk. My wife's piano, the dining table we bought when we had nothing, the photo frames I never had the heart to take down. I backed away from the door slowly, careful not to make a sound. My chest felt tight, but not in the way my doctor had warned me about. This wasn't medical. This was something else entirely. Something sharper. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't turn on the light. I just sat there in the dark, listening to the silence that followed. I thought about everything I had already signed over to them. The house, the land, the savings that were left after the treatments. All of it was supposed to go to my son, my only child. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was taking care of him. That night, I realized something I should have seen years ago. I wasn't a father to him anymore. I was a timeline. A countdown. And he was already planning the end. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat there, replaying their voices over and over again, until the sun started coming up through the blinds. By morning, something inside me had settled. Not grief, not even anger. Clarity. I got dressed slower than usual, took my time buttoning my shirt, made coffee like it was any other day. When they came into the kitchen, I acted exactly the same. I smiled. I asked about their plans. I listened to them talk. They had no idea I'd heard everything. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Because by then, I already knew what I was going to do. I finished my coffee, grabbed my coat, and told them I had an appointment. My son barely looked up from his phone. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah," I said, "just taking care of a few things." That part wasn't a lie. I drove straight to my lawyer's office, didn't call ahead, didn't give myself time to think twice. When I walked in, the receptionist looked surprised to see me. I told her I needed to make changes to my will, immediately. She asked if it was urgent. I told her yes. Very urgent. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about what my son needed. I was thinking about what he deserved. And as I sat down across from my lawyer, I said the words that would set everything in motion. "I want to change everything," I told him. He nodded slowly. "All right, what did you have in mind?" I looked him straight in the eye. And what I said next made him go completely silent. "Leave the house to them," I said. But only after they destroy themselves trying to take it. I grew up in a town so small that if you blinked, you'd miss half the population. Cedar Falls, Iowa, My father ran a hardware store, my mother kept the books, and I learned early that the world didn't owe you anything. By the time I was 25, I had built my own construction company from scratch. Not big, not flashy, but solid. My wife Margaret and I bought the old Victorian on Maple Street the day after our wedding. We poured everything into it, weekends, vacations, every paycheck. Every corner of that house has a memory. Margaret died 15 years ago. Cancer took her in a year, slow and merciless. My son Ryan was 12 then. He used to sit on the porch with me, hammering nails into random scraps of wood, asking a million questions, always wanting to know how things work. He was smart, caring, we were close. The kind of father-son bond you see in those movies, only ours was real. I told him everything about money, business, life, mistakes I'd made so he wouldn't repeat them. But somewhere in high school, Ryan started changing. He stopped asking questions, he started avoiding me. Teenage rebellion, I thought, it happens. Then he met Emily, my daughter-in-law, during college. Sweet girl, at least at first. Her family was wealthy, private schools, vacation homes. I didn't mind. I figured they'd balance each other out, my hardworking son, her privileged upbringing. They married 3 years later, and I welcomed her into the family. At first, she seemed normal enough, helpful, polite, even charming. Then came subtle things, little digs, offhand comments about my old-fashioned house or how outdated my furniture was. Ryan would laugh them off, but I noticed. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was too protective, too frugal, too stubborn. Maybe grief had hardened me in ways I didn't notice. I told myself they were just jokes. But over the years, the jokes started to feel like predictions. My health took a turn 2 years ago. Doctors whispered about heart issues, kidney problems, reduced life expectancy, the usual. I never feared death, I accepted it. But what I didn't accept was the idea that the people I trusted most were already anticipating it, ready to strip me of everything I had built. My house, my legacy, my life's work, it wasn't just property. It was memory, history, it was me. I tried subtle warnings, dropped hints about sentimental value, about the things that couldn't be replaced. Ryan nodded, smiled, and Emily rolled her eyes. I kept paying their bills, kept them comfortable, thinking that maybe, just maybe, family meant something more than money. But that morning when I overheard them talking, everything I thought I knew about them shattered in one sentence. I realized I had been naive. I realized that all the lessons I'd tried to teach Ryan about integrity, about respect, about building a life instead of taking one, they'd been ignored, replaced by greed, impatience, and a lack of conscience I hadn't thought possible in my own blood. I went to my lawyer that morning not just because I had to change my will, but because I needed to take control of something I hadn't been able to control for years. Their reckoning. I knew it wouldn't be simple. I knew it would take strategy, patience, and the kind of patience I didn't get from sitting on a porch and watching my son grow up. I would have to become a different person entirely, someone willing to weaponize every loophole, every contract, every legal nuance I could muster. By the time I left the lawyer's office, I wasn't just a man updating a document. I was a man preparing a trap, one they wouldn't see coming, and one they wouldn't be able to escape once it snapped shut. I didn't just want them to fail. I wanted them to destroy themselves, piece by piece, while thinking they were winning. And in that quiet, sterile office, as I signed the first papers, I realized something horrifying. The game had already begun. Because they thought I was dying. But in truth, I was more alive than I'd ever been. The next few weeks were a delicate performance. Ryan and Emily had no idea the shift had already happened. To them, I was still the frail old man they assumed would soon be out of the way, as they'd put it. I made sure to feed that illusion. I wore my cardigan, shuffled slower, coughed just enough to seem precarious, and smiled through their jokes. Every comment about how much time I had left only reinforced the narrative I let them believe. Meanwhile, I turned my attention to the lawyer. I spent hours reviewing every document, clause, and appendix. Mortgages, liens, estate taxes, insurance policies, personal property, every legal instrument became a weapon. I drew up conditions, contingencies, and stipulations that weren't obvious on first glance. Most were small, hidden in layers of legalese, but together they created a chain reaction I knew would crush them if they tried to move too fast. The house couldn't be sold without approval on repairs and appraisals. The trust fund had released conditions tied to years of residency and care for the property. Every loophole I had ever wished existed suddenly existed. And I made sure my lawyer, old friend from college, the only person I trusted, was fully on board. I didn't wait. I started documenting everything, discreetly. Receipts, emails, texts, even casual conversations about selling off the house or gutting old junk. I had an old voice recorder hidden in the office, and I placed it where they argued most. I even installed a few cameras, nothing overt, nothing illegal, but enough to catch their greed in motion. Then I tested them. I started mentioning renovations I had been thinking about in passing. A leaky roof, a cracked window, the old garden shed that might be a hazard. Ryan and Emily took the bait immediately. They asked if they could start making improvements now or hiring someone to clean up. I smiled and said no, that everything had to be done properly in writing with approvals. They groaned, but they complied. The real power came from watching their impatience grow. Emily started complaining more, her voice dripping with contempt I hadn't heard before. Ryan tried to maintain his polite veneer, but the frustration leaked through every conversation. They believed that by pressing, by pushing, by making deals behind my back, they could somehow accelerate what they saw as inevitable. And they were right, eventually they would, but on my terms, not theirs. One night I overheard them again, this time in the kitchen. Emily was griping about contractors, Ryan was calculating numbers on his phone. "I just don't understand why he's dragging this out," she hissed. "It's not like he's going to live forever." Ryan shrugged. "He's stubborn, we just have to wait, and when he's gone." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine, but also a surge of satisfaction. They were revealing themselves without knowing, and I recorded every word, every expression, every hint of greed, every plan to betray me. I began subtly nudging them into traps. A friendly contractor I sent over would write detailed reports about costs and damages, which I later incorporated into the trust conditions. A valuation expert I casually mentioned was actually reviewing the property for a hidden lien I had filed months earlier. Everything they did in their hurry to take the house ended up reinforcing the chain I'd laid out. By the time they thought they were ready to move forward, I had already built a legal maze with no exit. Every choice they made fed the mechanism. Every corner they cut was another link tightening around them. And yet, every night I went to bed feeling the same thing, a quiet, simmering anticipation, the calm before the storm, because even though they had no idea what was coming, the truth was simple. When they finally tried to take the house, they wouldn't just lose money, they would destroy themselves in the process. And they had no one to blame but themselves. The trap was set. But that's when the first real twist hit. I found out Ryan had been hiding something from me, something that could undo everything I had built. And it changed the game entirely. I discovered the truth by accident. I was reviewing some paperwork with my lawyer when he leaned back, frowned, and said something that made my stomach drop. "Do you realize Ryan already transferred part of the house's equity?" he asked slowly, "before you changed the will." At first I thought I misheard him. "What do you mean?" I asked. He tapped a folder. "He's been quietly putting parts of the property into a separate account, not a trust, not in your name, just gone, cash, equity, maybe even some personal property he could liquidate later." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. That smug, lazy confidence I had been feeding him, they weren't just greed, they were proactive. They were plotting even before I knew I'd overheard them. I left the lawyer's office without a word, driving the winding streets of Cedar Falls in silence. For the first time since this all started, I didn't feel in control. I felt hunted, and that meant I had to pivot, fast. I started digging, every bank, every account, every transaction they could possibly have access to. Ryan had been smart, too smart. He had opened accounts under subtle variations of his name, used digital wallets and kept the transfers just under the radar. Emily had helped him, of course. Her family connections made some of it effortless. They were laughing at me while pretending to care. It hit me then, I had underestimated them, and that was dangerous. But I also realized something else. Desperation could be manipulated. Even the smartest people make mistakes when they think they're untouchable. I went home that night and stared at the walls of the house. The room's full of memories, of decades of my life. Margaret's piano in the corner, the worn dining chairs with scratches from Ryan's childhood, the shelves I had built myself. Everything they thought they could sell was a lever. And I knew exactly how to use it. I started planting subtle evidence of fraud, of mismanagement. Little notes Emily left in the living room with reminders about selling old furniture, receipts for work that hadn't been approved, emails to contractors that implied they were acting without permission. I even staged a few conversations with our neighbors, carefully letting slip that they were talking about taking advantage of me. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to start a trail. Then I sent a few anonymous tips. To the city assessor, to contractors, even to a local journalist who had written about inheritance disputes before. Nothing too direct, nothing incriminating on its own, but enough that when the dominoes fell, it would look like Emily and Ryan were acting recklessly, maybe even illegally. And here's the cruelest part. They were moving exactly how I wanted them to. They thought they were ahead of me, thinking I was weak, thinking I didn't know. Each transfer, each plan, each little manipulative move they made only tightened the trap. But the realization that shook me more than anything was this. I wasn't just fighting for revenge anymore. I was fighting to protect everything Margaret and I had built. Not for Ryan, not for Emily, for the life we had created, for the house itself, a living record of the love and hard work they wanted to erase. That night I sat in my office, staring at the blueprints I had kept for years. The house wasn't just a building anymore, it was a weapon. And then I saw it, the one mistake Ryan had made that would give me complete leverage. It was small, almost laughably simple, but it was enough. Enough that if I acted right, if I played the timing perfectly, I could turn everything they had already schemed into a self-destruct mechanism they would never anticipate. And that's when I began the part that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Because the first twist wasn't just theirs, it was mine too. I knew exactly what I was going to do. And I knew it would leave them powerless. I spent the next week in near total silence, moving through the house like a ghost. Every creak of the floorboards reminded me of how long I'd lived here, how much I had endured, and how completely my own son and daughter-in-law had betrayed me. But I didn't act rashly. I couldn't. Impatience would ruin everything. Every move had to be calculated, precise, and invisible. I laid it all out on my desk. The original will, the revised version, copies of receipts, emails, contracts, and every trace of the small but crucial errors Ryan had made in transferring equity. I created timelines, scenarios, failsafes. If they tried to sell anything too quickly, I had insurance clauses that would freeze accounts. If they attempted unauthorized renovations, the liens I had quietly placed would lock them out legally. Every legal loophole, every oversight they had made, became a spike in the trap I was building. The most satisfying part, they were unknowingly contributing to it themselves. Every greedy move, every impatient whisper, every "let's just do this" moment I had recorded or documented became leverage I could exploit. I began writing letters to banks and contractors in my own name, questioning transactions, flagging irregularities, creating a paper trail that made them look careless, reckless even. I didn't need anyone to know it was me. All I needed was the illusion that someone outside the house was watching them. At night I walked through every room, examining what they had labeled junk. The old piano, the dining table, the shelves, the built-in cabinetry. They didn't see their worth, but I did. I imagined them selling pieces of our history for cash they thought was easy. Every object became a weapon in my mind. The more sentimental, the better. I even recruited allies without them knowing. A contractor who owed me a favor, a neighbor who despised Emily's snide remarks about local life, a local accountant who had worked with me for decades. All of them were briefed subtly, given just enough to participate in my plan, yet kept completely in the dark about my ultimate goal. I needed them to appear as part of the world, watching Ryan and Emily collapse under their own greed. And then I began staging small crises. A minor leak in the roof timed perfectly to coincide with a contractor visit. A tree branch threatening the garage, which I had noticed but left untrimmed. Subtle reminders that the house required attention, maintenance, care. All things they assumed they could ignore because they thought I wouldn't notice. I knew they would rush to fix them themselves, make mistakes, and reveal more of their recklessness. The night before the first domino fell, I overheard them again. Emily was complaining about money, about needing cash for renovations. Ryan was impatient, already calculating potential resale profits. Their conversation was raw greed, stripped of any pretense. Every word they said, every plan they plotted, fed the trap I had carefully constructed. I allowed myself a grim satisfaction. They thought they were advancing their agenda. They had no idea they were walking straight into it. Every law, every regulation, every small legal maneuver I had arranged was now a thread ready to tighten around them. And I wasn't acting out of anger anymore. I was acting out of inevitability. I slept lightly that night, knowing what had to happen next. When dawn broke, I wasn't just a man fighting for his house. I was a man orchestrating the unraveling of the people who had betrayed him. And by noon, I would put the first piece of the plan into motion. Because retaliation is useless if it's messy or hasty. True revenge doesn't just punish, it destroys methodically, leaving no chance for recovery. And I had all the time in the world. The morning the plan began to unfold, I felt the first tremor of panic, not for me, but for the unpredictability of human greed. Ryan and Emily had become predictable, but no one is ever perfectly predictable. And yet the universe had a sense of timing that I hadn't anticipated. I had instructed my lawyer to file an urgent notice with the county, one that froze any attempt to sell, renovate, or transfer ownership of the house. I had arranged for a property inspection that on paper made it appear as though Emily and Ryan were acting recklessly, violating codes, ignoring liens, and attempting unauthorized sales. It was all legal, meticulous, and invisible. But the twist came when I saw the news on my neighbor's porch TV. A local paper had picked up a story. Family accused of attempted property fraud in Cedar Falls, and Emily and Ryan were named. My eyes narrowed. They hadn't realized the lawyer had submitted the documents anonymously. They weren't just trapped by my legal maneuvers, they were publicly humiliated. I realized something else that shocked me. Emily had an ex-partner, someone I'd never met, a distant relative of her wealthy family. He had been quietly monitoring their moves online, probably sensing that money was involved, and apparently he had called in tips to multiple authorities before I even triggered my legal maneuvers. In other words, my son and daughter-in-law weren't just caught in my trap, they had created a network of exposure themselves. Every greedy move they had made before, every attempt to manipulate me, had left digital fingerprints that I hadn't even planned for, but now they were all coming back to haunt them. I sat in my office, staring at the phone, realizing the irony. My plan was supposed to be meticulous, controlled, but their own recklessness had accelerated the destruction, amplified it in ways I hadn't foreseen. They had no one to blame but themselves. Every legal twist I had designed was now reinforced by the chaos they had generated on their own. By late afternoon, calls started coming in, banks asking for clarification, contractors demanding proof of ownership before doing work, a city inspector threatening fines for unauthorized changes. Ryan and Emily were panicking, making calls I had intentionally documented, revealing their anxiety and guilt. Their stress wasn't just emotional, it was legally binding evidence against them. The most satisfying part, watching them argue, Emily screamed about how everything was already supposed to be ours, while Ryan tried to justify their actions. Neither realized they were being recorded, both by me and by the system of checks and evidence I had planted. Every word was a nail in the coffin I had built for them. And then it hit me, the final piece of the twist. The property insurance I had quietly updated months ago included a clause they could not possibly have anticipated. Any unauthorized alterations, any attempt to liquidate assets, automatically triggered a freeze and a reassessment that required months of legal review. They couldn't sell, they couldn't renovate, they couldn't even touch the house without stepping into a legal nightmare of my design. Their impatience had handed me the ultimate leverage. By the time evening came, they were frantic. Every phone call, every message, every minor action was creating evidence I could now use to ensure they would never be able to claim a cent without jumping through years of legal hoops. The desperation in their voices when they finally tried to call me, trying to fix things, was intoxicating. They thought they could charm me, negotiate with me, get an exception. But I smiled quietly, knowing I had already won. They had underestimated me once, twice, and the second twist, it wasn't me, they were the ones who had sealed their own fate. I realized then that revenge wasn't just about punishment. It was about patience, about letting someone destroy themselves while believing they were ahead, and they had done it all on their own. And the best part, I hadn't even revealed my full hand yet. I never intended for this revenge to be just about money or a house. That part was the lure, the bait, the baited hook that drew them in. No, the real reason I set all of this in motion was far deeper. It was about respect, about recognition, about the fact that for years I had given everything I had to raise Ryan, to nurture him, to teach him right from wrong, and he spat on all of it. Sitting in the living room one night, I pulled out the old photo albums. Margaret and I, Ryan as a toddler, birthdays, Christmas mornings, messy hands from painting and cookies. Every page reminded me I had built a life worth protecting, and they had attempted to destroy it, to erase decades of love and labor for a quick payout. That's when I understood something horrifying. They didn't just see me as old or weak, they saw me as irrelevant. And once someone stops seeing you as human, they stop respecting the consequences of their actions. That's when vengeance becomes not just satisfying, but necessary. I called my lawyer and told him exactly what I wanted the final act to be. Not just legal punishment, not just financial ruin. I wanted them humiliated, stripped of control, forced to confront the full weight of their actions. They would look at the house, at the legacy of a life I had poured myself into, and see themselves reflected in the ruin they had caused, not the ruin of the house, but the ruin of their own choices. Every small trap I'd set, the liens, the inspections, the freezes, the staged crises, was designed for this final revelation. And it wasn't just about them losing property. It was about forcing them to understand what it meant to betray someone who trusted you completely. I wanted them to feel powerless, because power is what they had taken for granted all these years. The truth is, revenge had become personal, not just to punish, but to educate, to expose, to leave no room for denial. I knew that once they realized how thoroughly I had dismantled their plans, they would see themselves for what they were: selfish, impatient, blind to the life and love they had been given. And I knew they would never forgive themselves. That was the dramatic reason, the part no one else could touch. I wasn't just protecting a house. I was reclaiming my dignity, my history, my life. And I was teaching them, in the harshest possible way, the cost of betrayal. I walked through the kitchen that evening, noticing the dents in the cabinets they had already made trying to rush repairs, the scratches on the floor from moving furniture without permission, the disorganized mess they had created while thinking they were in control. Every mark, every mistake, every frantic note and whisper reinforced the lesson. They were not in control. They never had been. I sat back in the armchair, sipping my coffee quietly, listening to the tension in the air as they tried to strategize around the traps I'd laid. Every frantic phone call, every whispered argument, every desperate attempt to gain a foothold only tightened the noose. This wasn't just revenge, it was poetic, it was just. It was the culmination of a life spent giving and trusting, crushed under the weight of a betrayal so complete it would leave them trembling. And when the final confrontation came, they would understand, not just what they had done to me, but what they had done to themselves. Because betrayal, left unchecked, is the most destructive force of all. And I had made sure they learned that lesson the hard way. The morning it all came together, I walked through the house with a quiet calm I hadn't felt in years. Ryan and Emily were already panicking, checking phones, flipping through emails, trying to find some loophole they could exploit. But every step they took, every frantic decision had been anticipated. Every trap I had set, the freezes, the liens, the staged crises, the public exposure, was now tightening around them like a noose they could never slip out of. I let them stew for hours, letting their panic grow. Emily screamed at Ryan over miscalculations they had made trying to liquidate equity before it was legally frozen. Contractors called to confirm permissions they didn't have. Inspectors arrived, citing violations they had created themselves. Bank representatives phoned with questions that revealed every fraudulent transaction Ryan had attempted. I just watched. Sat in the living room, Margaret's piano in the corner, the walls full of memories they had dismissed. Their own actions were now the chains binding them. By mid-afternoon, the phone calls slowed because there was nothing they could do. They had burned every bridge, trapped themselves in legal limbo, and had no recourse. And that's when I revealed the final piece. I called them into the living room, and calmly, almost gently, I laid out the truth. You tried to take what wasn't yours, I said, voice steady. Every transfer, every plan, every attempt to bypass the rules, you documented it yourselves. You've created evidence of your own greed, your own betrayal. You can't sell, you can't touch the house. You can't even make repairs without legal consequences, fines and investigations. And all of it is entirely your doing. Ryan's face went pale. Emily's hands shook. They looked at each other, realizing in that moment that everything they had counted on, everything, had collapsed. The house, the money, the legacy, they had tried to claim it all, and in doing so, they had destroyed their own chance. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten. I just let them sit there, absorbing the weight of their failure, and then I told them the part they would remember forever. Every choice you made was based on greed, impatience, and disrespect. You acted like my death was inevitable, like you were entitled to the life I built. But the truth is, you were never in control. You destroyed yourselves while believing you were winning. And now, the house, everything you wanted, it's gone for you piece by piece, and there's nothing you can do to fix it. I left them there broken, staring at the walls that held a lifetime of memories they had tried to erase. Every contractor call, every lien, every inspector, every legal maneuver I had anticipated, they had played into perfectly, unknowingly building their own undoing. For the first time in years, I felt something other than pain, something sharp and pure, satisfaction. Satisfaction that they had learned the full cost of betrayal. Satisfaction that, for once, justice wasn't abstract or delayed, it was immediate and unflinching. I went upstairs and looked out the window at the maple trees Margaret and I had planted decades ago. The house was still mine. The life we had built was still intact. And my son, the boy I had raised, was finally facing the consequences of the man he had become. I didn't gloat, I didn't call the neighbors. I didn't revel in humiliation. I just let them sit there, crushed by the weight of their own choices. And when I finally returned to my study, shutting the door behind me, I felt the last tension drain from my chest. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated the life I had built. And they had paid the price for it in full. Some lessons are cruel, some lessons are permanent, and this one was unforgettable. The house would remain in my hands for the rest of my life, but more importantly, Ryan and Emily would never forget what it meant to betray the person who gave them everything. Revenge had been patient, but now it was complete.